Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Emily Griep, and I'm the Manager of Food Safety at United Fresh. On today's webinar, as part of the United Fresh Food Safety webinar series, we'll be talking about Zone 1 sampling for Listeria in produce operations, covering a review of regulatory policy. And knowing that this is a difficult and often controversial topic, particularly in fresh produce, we'll also review a handful of strategies for any operations who may be considering implementing Zone 1 sampling within their own packing houses or facilities in the future. So before we begin, a few logistics items. All phone lines will be muted throughout the duration of the webinar. We do have a chat function that you should see at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that to ask questions at any point throughout the webinar. But we will dedicate at least the last 10, probably 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for those questions. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to the recording to all attendees later this week or early next week. So with that, I'd like to turn it over briefly to Brittany Wiebe, who is the Senior Corporate Account Manager for Ecolab's Food and Beverage Division, with a message from our sponsor. Brittany?
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, we're really happy to be supporting United Fresh with these food safety webinars. You know, as your partners in sanitation, we completely understand the challenges that food safety professionals, quality managers, sanitation managers of the like are up against when dealing with these things, especially when we go into more detail about developing teams around your environmental monitoring programs and whatnot. And so we know that this is a vital part of the process, and we thank you, United Fresh, for the time that you dedicate to these important messaging to the produce industry, and happy to contribute.
Thanks very much, Brittany, and we, of course, appreciate it as well. So before getting into the main content of the webinar, I wanted to preface with some reminders or disclaimers, caveats, what have you. Because, as I said, this is such an important topic, while they may or may not seem like obvious points, I wanted to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And so the first point being that in all references to Zone 1 sampling that we're making today, we are very specifically talking about Listeria species. That is the broader genus of Listeria, not the pathogenic Listeria monocytogenes. That is, unless we are talking about the decision whether or not you speciate a sample. But in general, anytime we are saying Zone 1 sampling, again, it is for Listeria species. The second point being that Zone 1 sampling for Listeria is very context dependent on a number of factors that are going to be very specific to your operation. And it simply may not be appropriate in all situations or for all operations at this point in time. And so that brings me to the related point being that Zone 1 sampling is not something to jump into. For any operation, big or small, it requires a great deal of thoughtful preparation, such as in your sanitation procedures, the structure of your EMP, or your corrective action or response plan. And so these are some of the things that we'll be covering today. So while our goal is to get you, help get you started thinking a little bit more deeply about environmental monitoring programs and to help you judge whether or not Zone 1 sampling can be implemented in your operation and how, I certainly don't expect, and I hope that no one listening today turns around and takes their very first sample for Listeria species on their conveyor belt tomorrow, because that's, you know, just asking for difficulties. That said, some key points that we hope you come away with today. I assume that those of you listening are here because you recognize that there is a lot that the industry can and must do to prevent the persistence of Listeria in packing houses and in facilities, and strong environmental monitoring programs are a key part of that. Recognizing and hoping to encourage this, the FDA made a somewhat recent change, not quite so recent change, in regulatory mindset that makes Zone 1 sampling possible. And then at least in the case of registered facilities, they may come to expect that. And that's the case even in fresh produce. The fact that there is no kill step that would reduce the risk of Listeria on incoming product is certainly a challenging factor, but it is one that is manageable, particularly in the way that you design your sampling plan. And so make sure to rely on existing industry resources, not only those that we've developed at United Fresh, such as the Listeria guidance document, but also, any commodity or regional specific resources or, university extension programs. There are a number of resources out there that can aid you as you continue developing and enhancing your environmental monitoring programs. Starting with a brief reminder on FSMA and the requirements within the preventive controls and produce safety rules as it applies to Listeria. Within preventive controls, there is a specific focus on environmental pathogens and the control of the environmental pathogens, which defines environmental pathogens including both Listeria and Salmonella. The FDA has developed and is developing a number of draft guidance chapters for those different preventive controls, and they have published their draft guidance on Listeria back in 2017. Which is what we'll talk about later in this presentation, because it really was the catalyst for why we're even talking about Zone 1 sampling today. Within the produce safety rule, there are also general sanitation requirements, particularly within your buildings or packing houses, but there is no specific call out for Listeria. Despite this, however, I would say Listeria does not really care whether your operation is under the preventive controls rule or the produce safety rule. So whether it's a regulatory requirement or not, I don't think anyone here would disagree that environmental monitoring programs are absolutely still a good practice for packing houses. And this, in fact, is a major focus for CPS research as well as various Listeria workshops, including our own that we co-organize with the Produce Marketing Association. Within any produce operation, whether it's a pack house or fresh cook facility, we know that there are limited options when it comes to controlling Listeria. First being limiting what's coming in on your produce from the field. This hasn't been a major focus in the past, partly because of the acknowledgement that yes, Listeria is naturally present in the soil and in the growing environment, so you can never fully eliminate it. But there is certainly recognition that there are steps you can take to limit it. And I think that's something that we'll see a bit more focus in this area in the future. For produce, we know that killing it is not an option due to a number of different processing limitations. So our only other option is to accept that it is going to be coming in on your product. And so you do everything you can do to prevent establishment, thereby protecting your product from repeat contamination from any potential resident Listeria. And of course, we use environmental monitoring to verify that our sanitation procedures are effective at doing so. So the objectives overall of an environmental monitoring program are multifaceted. By routinely sampling your facility and equipment, first, again, you are making sure that you're addressing and removing any of the transient Listeria from incoming product. You're also then verifying that those controls are effective and doing what they are designed or what they're meant to do. If for some reason those controls aren't effective, your EIMP will then help you detect Listeria that has established itself in or around your equipment and the surrounding environment. And finally, through trending of your data and paying attention to your sampling history and having an understanding of your overall program, an EMP helps you determine what your corrective actions should be in the event of a positive and whether or not those corrective actions are also effective. So overall, the goal of an EMP is that if Listeria is in your operation, you find it. However, despite this seek and destroy mantra, there has been traditionally a fear of finding it. And FDA's zero tolerance policy has been a part of that. And so this stems back to FDA policy going back to 2008 with their draft guidance, where the assumption was if you don't speciate your positive Listeria results, the assumption is that it is L. mono. And on one hand, it's understandable that if you react with the urgency as if it were a pathogen, you'll improve your overall programs to prevent Listeria monocytogenes from becoming a persistent problem if it is ever there in the future. On the other hand, the downside of this being that if you tested your food contact surfaces and got a positive back for Listeria species, reacting as if it were the pathogen likely means a recall and potentially putting in a report to the reportable food registry unless you held product. And that's one of the challenges for produce commodities that have a short shelf life, where you don't have even the extra 2 or 3 days that it might take to get those results back. So the overall underlying message became don't look for it. In 2017, however, FDA released its updated draft guidance for the control of Listeria monocytogenes in ready-to-eat foods. And this is where we see the big shift, the change in FDA's mindset that we talk about. So contrary to the 2008 guidance, this draft guidance indicated that a positive finding for Listeria species does not automatically mean that it's positive for L. mono. While it did reaffirm its stance of zero tolerance in ready-to-eat foods, this new policy was really meant to encourage the testing of product contact surfaces. And so while the guidance does contain a great deal of useful information, it's worth pointing out that the guidance recommends testing of Zone 1 surfaces during production, which is another challenge for produce due to the lack of kill steps and the difficulty that's then presented in distinguishing it from a resident Listeria strain within your operation, or if it's a transient Listeria that has come in on your produce. And it's also worth noting that this draft guidance is directed to registered facilities, which again does not include packing houses necessarily. And it also applies to a wide range of FDA-regulated products, not just produce. So in some cases, we found that there are aspects of the guidance that can be applied to produce, but in other areas, it just really isn't applicable to the fresh produce industry. So getting more specifically into this new regulatory approach as it's laid out in the draft guidance. As I said, there is still zero tolerance for Listeria monocytogenes in food. But even if we are sampling a product contact surface, it is appropriate to use Listeria species as an indicator for Listeria monocytogenes. If you have a finding of Listeria species, it does not automatically mean that Listeria monocytogenes is present. And a finding of Listeria species does not automatically trigger a need for speciation. And then finally, an isolated positive, and I guess I would emphasize there that it is isolated, that this isolated positive for Listeria species on a product contact surface does not render product adulterated. And so in other words, there is no need to report to the reportable food registry or have a recall of product. So each of these bullets collectively open the doors to allow that flexibility for really all facilities and operations, not isolated just to produce. And so partly in response to the FDA draft guidance, considering those limitations to produce that I had mentioned, and also partly in response to just new research and new industry best practices that had come out, United Fresh revised our own Listeria guidance. And so the original version was drafted in 2013, and is specifically tailored to fresh produce. In this new 2018 revision that we published, I think it was almost about a year ago, we expanded the overall scope of the guidance to include both fresh cut facilities and packing houses. And we also added some additional case studies. We also included guidance specifically as it relates to that FDA's draft guidance, which includes Zone 1 strategies that give approaches that we feel it still fulfills the intent of the FDA's guidance while recognizing that lack of kill steps and subsequent associated challenges. So even as people are becoming more aware of the new approach by FDA, the produce industry has been slow to adopt Zone 1 sampling for a number of different reasons that we've heard from people. And many of them are reasonable, or at least they're understandable. So some of those reasons we've heard first is just skepticism. Is the FDA really going to be okay with a Listeria positive on the Zone 1 surface? There still is just really an underlying level of discomfort there. I've mentioned this already, but there's also uncertainty given the lack of kill step. What does it really mean if I get a positive? How can I make that determination of whether it's transient versus resident? There's also a lack of clarity in the corrective action process that needs to be followed in the event of a Zone 1 positive. So how does it or should it differ from the responses to a Zone 2, 3, or 4 positive? Another key concern we've heard is general customer pushback. In some cases, it might be that my customer won't buy from me if I'm sampling my product contact surfaces. Or my customer has a requirement that we speciate the samples, and in that case, we're back to the requirement that you need to hold product. Finally, there's this question of, if I have a strong environmental monitoring program for Zones 2, 3, and 4, why do I need to sample Zone 1? But I think that question can go both ways. If you're confident in your program, shouldn't you want to expand it further? Shouldn't you feel confident that your food contact surfaces are being adequately cleaned and sanitized? And if you're not, if there are certain parts of your equipment or your SOPs that you're just not totally confident in, that's okay. But that can be an indication that you need to prioritize resources towards those areas. But you should always be pushing towards improvement of your program. So again, that's not to say that Zone 1 sampling should be the end-all or be-all, end-all goal that everyone is working towards, but it's not a bad idea to evaluate your systems and think, what are the areas that make me uncomfortable about Zone 1 sampling? And before even implementing Zone 1 sampling, what can I do to improve them now? And so at the end of the day, whether you do include food contact surfaces in your environmental monitoring programs or not, FDA wants to know that you're looking. Your EMP needs to be well thought out, and it needs to be defensible. So considering those different reasons that we've heard from industry members as to why there is hesitation to implement Zone 1 sampling, in some cases we found that really it can be a matter of education that can be a big help in sorting through these challenges. So United Fresh, about a year ago, a little bit less, we put together a volunteer working group made up of our members from our Food Safety Council to develop a set of case studies that can illustrate the corrective action response if an operation gets a Zone 1 positive. So, however, as the group met a couple of times over the past year, one of the sticking points that we faced is that by just having this set of case studies alone, the underlying assumption is that you're already sampling your Zone 1 surfaces. And I think that didn't quite get people to, the just bringing to the level to where do they feel ready to even start Zone 1 sampling. So over time, our set of case studies really evolved into a broader resource. So it consists of a few additional parts, the first being highlighting of existing resources. So particularly within our United Fresh, the overall Listeria guidance, it's about a 60 or 65 page document that has a lot of great information, and it does already include, as I mentioned, information on Zone 1 sampling. But it is scattered throughout that document in various relevant sections. So rather than just reinventing the wheel, we felt it would be useful to compile what we already have. We've also included a list of questions to consider before you implement Zone 1 sampling. So to help answer that question of how do I know when I'm ready, what prerequisites do I need, and what are the kind of minimum baseline standards to be ready for Zone 1 sampling. Finally, we also included some alternatives to implementing Zone 1 sampling within your routine program. And I think this is particularly useful because if we say that Zone 1 sampling isn't something that you should jump into, by offering alternatives to just adding it into your weekly or monthly swabbing, provides a way to step into it and make sure that you are appropriately prepared. And I do want to thank both Brittany Wiebe, who you heard from, as well as Ashish Pandit from Palm Wonderful, who volunteered to really take on and lead the development of this resource. So after all of this background, the later portion of our webinar is now going to focus on those strategies that we've put together within the Zone 1 resource, starting first at the beginning. So how do you know you're ready for Zone 1 sampling? We ended up breaking this into a few different areas. So the next few slides, it's certainly not an exhaustive list, but these are just some questions that we thought were generally helpful indications as to whether or not you are ready for Zone 1 sampling. So first, starting out with just general knowledge. Are you familiar with the United Fresh guidance or the FDA guidance documents for Listeria monitoring and control? Really, do you know what supporting resources are out there if you do ever have questions? And even included in this question could be, do you know industry experts who you can turn to if you do get a positive and need help investigating or just need a little bit more detailed guidance? Do you know the specific hazards associated with your product? Do you know the history of Listeria or other pathogen risks? What outbreaks have been associated with your product? These are all kind of clues and resources that can help guide you and can help answer questions as you're developing your own environmental monitoring programs for your commodity, for your operation. Also, has someone in your organization attended a Listeria-specific or other EMP training? This certainly is not a plug that you need to attend the joint PMA United Fresh Listeria workshop that happens to be taking place on October 30th and 31st in Pennsylvania. In my biased opinion, it is a good workshop, but the overall point here is that you want to be armed with just as much knowledge as possible. So then looking into your EMP and your operational history, do you have a documented history of Zone 2 and Zone 3 sampling in your operation? So that first set of questions were really just kind of things that are good to have, good to know. But this first question, I would say, is an absolute must. And I'd go on further to say that if you have ongoing persistent issues, particularly in Zone 2 or Zone 3 areas, I would caution against moving into Zone 1 until you know the root cause of your Zone 2 or your Zone 3 issues. So along those same lines, do you have an understanding of your equipment cleanability or just the general weaknesses in your facility? Do you have well-developed SOPs for each piece of equipment? Are your employees properly trained to those SOPs? And do they have the right tools to execute those SOPs? Understanding your equipment and the weaknesses in your facility can then help you determine, do you know where you'll target Zone 1 sampling and why? So ideally, this would be based on your environmental monitoring history that tells you where might I be likely to find it. And then on the reaction side, do you have a corrective action response plan in place in the event of a Zone 1 positive? So again, I would say this is another absolute must. By going through this sampling with a plan in place and specific to the different areas that you may be sampling, you're much less likely to panic if you get a positive, and you can make well-informed, critically thought-out decisions to eradicate the issue. Finally, do you know who's on your support team for corrective action and root cause analysis in the event of a positive? So if you do have a strong EMP in place already, then you likely do kind of have this in place already as well. But it is, in general, it's recommended that within this kind of response group, you include a broad group of people who have different areas of expertise within your operation and different perspectives that they can bring to the table and really help you dig into the root cause. On the communication side, is your operation aware of your Zone 1 sampling plans? Depending on the makeup of your company, this can be all the way from the top executive level down to your employees in the pack house or in your facility, particularly the ones who actually clean the equipment. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. And they should also know and understand your rationale, the reasoning behind Zone 1 sampling and potential outcomes, either good or bad. And along those lines, making sure that they also understand potential financial impact that may be associated with your Zone 1 sampling. So another area that has been particularly difficult, another question that's been difficult, and one that we just can't answer for you, is whether or not you should put your product on hold. So again, I want to reiterate that from the FDA standpoint, because you're not testing for the pathogen, it's not required. Because there is, again, no assumption that a positive for Listeria species means that it's a positive for Listeria monocytogenes. By taking this stance, it reduces the burden for fresh produce items where, as I said, you don't have those extra 2 to 3 days within your supply chain to wait for results. However, I would add that this is only true on your first round of Zone 1 sampling. So if you are in the investigation process after having repeat positives on the same Zone 1 surface, at that point, and according to the FDA within their guidance document, you should be holding product. The reality is that testing product contact surfaces without holding product makes people uncomfortable, but it ultimately comes down to a business decision depending on your product shelf life, if you have the warehouse space for it. Again, going back to what are your customer expectations and potential consequences if any positive, whether it's initial or follow-up positive, occur. And that said, if you do make the decision to hold product, you should, again, before you move into Zone 1 sampling, have the disposition guidelines already in place. So now if you have all of those questions answered and are feeling confident in your EMP and you feel like you're ready to start Zone 1 sampling, the next logical question becomes, what if I do get a positive sample? And so I wanted to point out Table 6 in the FDA's draft guidance, because this is where we get their recommendation on, or their guidance on how to react if you get a positive. And if you haven't seen this before, it's broken out into non-food contact surfaces, so zones 2, 3, and 4, and food contact surfaces. And it's also broken out into whether or not the food does or does not support the growth of Listeria. So not focusing on the argument as to whether certain produce commodities do or don't support the growth of Listeria, if we look at the column that's outlined in red, considering a product does support the growth of Listeria, essentially using this, treating it as the worst case scenario, within that first row is the corrective action after routine sampling positive number 1. And this is where you see it's clean and sanitize the area of the positive, retest it during the next production cycle, and conduct a comprehensive investigation. So I want to emphasize here that gets brought up a lot, but this is not a free pass for your operations to find Listeria on a zone 1 surface and not react. The purpose is that if you do find it, yes, you don't necessarily have a potential recall of product, but you are reacting aggressively and cleaning it up. Because I'll point out that in that second row, after follow-up positive number 2 occurs, those corrective actions greatly escalate, which includes holding of your product. And as you follow it through to follow-up positive number 3 and 4, it gets even much more serious than that. And this is really a place that you just don't want to be, which is why we emphasize that you are prepared to react aggressively after positive number 1. So on that cheery thought, I will hand it over to Brittany Wiebe, who will then walk you through these steps.
Thanks, Emily. So what if you do get a positive, right? The underlying question that's scary to all of us out there. The first thing is don't panic. Easier said than done, but as Emily, referenced before, the more prepared you are, the better you're going to be able to react in these types of situations. That being said, we can't drop the ball either, right? This is when you really want to rally your EMP team, as we mentioned before, and begin your thorough investigation while dealing with the situation. So oftentimes you're doing the investigation in tandem with your corrective actions, right? This is the time where you got to dig out your records and analyze all that data that you've been collecting so far, right? Has any Listeria been detected in or around the site before? What about adjacent equipment or other zones? The key here is not making any assumptions whatsoever. Even the most bogus of ideas could really lead you to the critical area that's causing the situation. Assuming that your sanitation standard operating procedures or SSOPs have been previously validated and that they are thoroughly detailed, you should have confidence in your existing program. But once again, don't assume anything. Take the SSOP out onto the floor with you and ensure that your own eyes are seeing what is written and is being completed and has been validated is actually taking place. In some situations, something gets changed, nobody was notified, documents didn't get updated, and could be a critical area of concern. You want to make sure that you're checking the traffic flow patterns. Once again, has anything changed? Has anything new come into the situation? Are you running a new product that maybe requires an extra set of hands, or different things coming in from different directions that you didn't necessarily consider before? Has something changed on the equipment? Employee turnover can sometimes be an issue. In addition, make sure that you're talking to the people on the floor. Have they noticed anything? These are the people that are living and breathing it day in and day out, and they can oftentimes tell you a lot more than what, in some cases, even your leadership team or supervisors or managers even know about what's going on. Was anything different, or did something unusual, such as maintenance, repair, construction in the area, or even inclement weather happen at the time that the sampling took place? Ensure that any and all GMP compliance issues are addressed immediately, right? That's something we can obviously assume that we need to do. And ensure that you make note of what was seen in your corrective actions. So documentation is very, very vital. During investigations, it's possible that you identify more than one potential cause. However, all need to be addressed, and it may be hard to keep track of everything. This information is very valuable for future investigations. So even though one opportunity may have been identified and maybe wasn't the root cause, that's not necessarily saying that it won't be the root cause if something occurs in the future. You also want to make sure that you note the time that the original sample was taken. The exact time of the sampling in addition to the location is very critical to your investigation. If we look at timing of the Zone 1 sample in more detail, interpretation of a positive really depends on when the surface was sampled, before or after cleaning and sanitation. If it's tested before sanitation, the positive result could come from a problematic harborage, or it could be the result of a transient that was present on incoming product that came in, they referenced before. If you're doing the timing after, then it may be a clear indication of inadequate sanitation and or a harborage upon which, aggressive corrective action should be taken. So as Emily mentioned, the FDA recommends operational sampling in their draft guidance, which is a great reference. United Fresh recommendation is that sampling is taken after sanitation and after the equipment has been running, but without product. So it's a great point of reference. When we're talking about corrective actions and specifically reswabbing, a recommendation, is that for zones 2, 3, and 4 positives, you want to reswab, clean and sanitize the area, conduct the vector swabbing, and really dig into what the root cause is. If we have zone 1 positives, on the other hand, if the sample was taken after sanitation, you know that there's an issue, possibly entrenchment or an improper application of the SSOP, as I alluded to before, and you definitely don't want to find it again. So I would like to reference once again the table, the FDA guidance table 6 that Emily showed us previously, and specifically that follow-up sampling of positive number 2, where it does indicate that that's when you need to start putting product on hold. So to reiterate, immediately we need to be aggressive with our cleaning, right? We need to be methodical and work with our team to make sure that we are really honing in and figuring out what the best immediate solution is going to be. That could be possibly different types of chemistries that you're using. It could be more thorough investigation of the actual cleaning procedure, extra set of hands, you name it. But we need to ensure that it's eradicated as best as we possibly can. In the long term or immediate future, that's when we really need to kind of circle back and make sure that we are very thorough in terms of our SSOPs, right? If we know that this procedure was validated and working before, what's changed, right? Has the equipment just over time seen normal wear and tear, and now we need to increase certain items on our master sanitation schedule? Do we need to go back and work with our employees? There could be an onslaught of things that you need to do, but we need to make sure that once that immediate aggressive cleaning is conducted, we can't just set it and forget it. We really have to do our due diligence and go back to the overall process. And once again, we can't reiterate enough the importance of documenting all of the corrective actions that were taken and then the results that ensued following. Additional responses to a positive, right? So as I mentioned before, we need to make sure that we're reacting aggressively to the persistent positive results in the zones 2, 3, and 4. As mentioned, we need to do intensive sanitation, possibly increase preventative maintenance. So this is where we need to really do a risk assessment on our equipment and understand better about where things may be harboring. Is there, a time where we need to set aside to disassemble the equipment, look at alternative methods of really making sure that we're addressing entrenchment issues. Another option too is subtyping of the isolates to give us some more information about the issues that we're seeing. We also want to continue tracking and frequently reviewing the results over time. So even though things may improve, it's not the time to let your foot up off the gas, right? Because things could pop up. And like you said, there may be multiple potential causes for the positive, and you're just trying to do everything that you can to address all of those issues. So unless you have thorough follow-up, there's really no indication to make yourself feel comfortable that it's not going to come up again. So once it's dealt with and you've got a corrective action in place, it's very, very critical to make sure that you're following up on those actions. And as mentioned, until you're consistently seeing negative results, consider increasing the frequency of the sampling in that particular zone to ensure that the contaminants are quickly identified. If you're concerned about going into zone 1 sampling, or if you think that you feel very comfortable about zones 2, 3, and 4 sampling, and you're thinking about taking the jump into zone 1, we discussed some recommendations that you could possibly look into as a gateway before you go into full-blown zone 1 sampling. First of which is extensive sampling during the extended downtime, right? So this ultimately removes the risk of product implication and the need to hold, which is usually a large concern for the processor. A few things that we want to remember when we go into this, right? First, we really want to make sure that we're creating a clean break pre and post sampling. This ensures that you know exactly what took place during that sampling and kind of helps you to eliminate other potential issues that could be causing a sample to come up positive. You want to run all of the moving parts on the line for an extended period prior to sampling. We all know once those belts and things start moving, stuff starts oozing, right? And so that's really the critical time. We want to find this stuff, right? So we want to make sure that we're aggressive and that we're seeking to find where it's hiding so that we can eradicate it. We want to keep the line down until results are known. So this really goes back to what Emily had mentioned before in making sure that leadership is on board with the plan in place and that you do have everything thoroughly vetted out and everybody understands what is coming, right? So that can obviously assist and aid in the process. And then finally, positive results usually indicate entrenchment or a breakdown in your SSOPs, right? So always going back to the basics, making sure to keep things simple and, make sure that you're not making any assumptions. So Emily, with that, I will lead it back to you.
All right, thank you, Brittany. So to wrap things up, I just wanted to get back to an important point regarding your overall decision to test zone 1, and that is that you really need to be clear of your reasons for doing so. So if you really evaluate your EMP and you feel strong and confident about the sampling that you're doing for zones 2 through 4, you feel good about the corrective actions and your history, and if you want to continue understanding your equipment and further verify your sanitation procedures, then yes, you may be ready to make that step into zone 1 sampling. Again, if it's more on the kind of for cause or investigation side, if you've had some repeat positives in a zone 2 or 3 area, your line is about to be shut down for this season and you're looking to investigate a little bit more. If you're wanting to do that extensive sampling, kind of that alternative to the routine sampling that Brittany had just mentioned. However, if it's the case where you just inherited a new EMP, you're at a packing house and you're not currently sampling zone 1 surfaces except maybe ATP, or if you're doing total plate count, something like that, but you've heard that you should be zone 1 sampling. That's not a good enough rationale, at least at this point. I feel like a broken record, but we really just want to emphasize that you're clear on your reasoning and you are well prepared to move into zone 1 sampling. So overall, we just wanted to, to summarize things to say your EMP should be a working tool in the operation. And it should be a living document. It should be revisited as changes occur or as new knowledge is gained about the operation, or even as, if an outbreak or if a food safety issue has occurred within your same commodity, use that as a time to reevaluate and revisit your EMP. Also, Zone 1 sampling doesn't have to be scary, but it should be approached with reasonable caution, and I think we've made that point well enough. Again, build into it in a stepwise fashion. And again, lean on the existing resources that are already out there. So I've mentioned that our United Fresh Listeria guidance is freely available on our website already. The final Zone 1 resources that we're working on isn't quite finished. We're kind of wrapping that up and actually still working on those actual case studies that I had mentioned at the beginning. But that's something we're hoping to have done by the end of the year, and it will be shared on our website, freely available, and we will share that link also with the webinar attendees. And so with that, we have about 13 minutes left for questions. I see we've had a couple questions already coming in. So I know we still have Brittany as well as Ashish on the line to answer questions for the webinar today. And I will also add, if at any point you have questions outside of the webinar, Dr. Jennifer McIntyre and myself are always happy to help answer any questions that you have. So with that, do we want to get it kicked off on the first question?
Yeah, so I can help out reading the questions, Emily. So the first question is in regards to validation of SSOPs. So it says, when we were referencing, assuming that your SSOPs have been validated, right? So I think the theory here is that you want to have a good baseline to know that your sanitation procedures are effective at removing any contaminants, right, on their surfaces. And so prior to going into Zone 1 swabbing, in order to have that confidence, it's recommended that there is some vetting that takes place prior to doing that, right? And that way, should you find a Zone 1 positive during routine swabbing, you can kind of go back and say, that something may be occurring outside of necessarily a sanitation practice if everything was being followed according to your written SSOP, right? Because you had previously confirmed and verified or validated, rather, that was working. Now, verification is a whole other element too, right, to ensure that what you're saying that you're doing is actually being completed regularly, right? So that's a whole other element to it. Anything that you wanted to add to that, Emily or Ashish?
No, I don't have anything to add there.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would add is that from the preventive control standpoint, it is not a requirement that the sanitation TCs are validated, but as Brittany said, I think there are ways to go about doing that, and there are people who are working on validating their SSOPs, and I think Brittany, you've had quite a bit of experience with people kind of working through that process. Correct.
Yep. So the next question is, for zones 2, 3, and 4, why is re-swabbing recommended prior to cleaning, sanitizing, and vectoring? Is this to confirm transient versus harborage?
I'll take that, Brittany. So our thought here was, there's a lot happening during production, a lot of moving parts. Employees are walking from one department, one area to another. So really, re-swabbing prior to cleaning or sanitizing, it will serve two purposes. One, to understand if this organism was spreading within a particular area. And two, hopefully it can help you identify the source where the contamination could be coming from, because the site at which you find a suspect may not necessarily be the origination of contamination. So it just gives you more data and a broader picture of where the organism could be coming. And just from one result, I wouldn't conclude whether it's a transient or harborage. I think there needs to be subsequent swabbing to understand if it's transient or if something's really harboring in the facility.
Yeah, and I would also add that it's within zones 2 and 4. That's a case where you really do want to keep finding it so you can answer whether or not you've gotten rid of it. And so the weight of finding a positive for zones 2, 3, and 4 isn't the same as the weight if you find a positive on zone 1. And so that's something where even if you're swabbing before cleaning and you find it again, that's an okay thing, again, as long as you are reacting to it.
So Emily, I think this next question is for you. Can you address FDA's stance on high-resolution finished product testing in lieu of Zone 1 environmental testing?
You know what? That's actually something I would have to get back to you on. So I know I have the name of the person who had asked that question. It's something that I'm going to want to make sure I'm not saying the wrong thing. So that's something we can certainly come back to.
Fair enough. Next question is, do Listeria tests have to be sent to a third-party lab?
That's a good question, and I don't know if there's anything in regulation that requires it has to be sent to a third-party lab. But if you're a manufacturing facility and the lab is housed as an extension of the manufacturing facility, I don't think it would be a good idea to be testing in-house in case if something's growing. You just want that to be completely out of the facility. What is your take, Emily, on it?
Yeah, and I will say, I know there are some who, some operations who do choose to test their own samples, and, there are a lot of different types of tests that you can use. But I think the more important question or more important answer is the method, a validated, verified method? So that's something that we actually have developed a new workshop on that we will have this week, is into kind of a lot of those, how to design a sampling plan, and it also gets into, how do you evaluate those different methods. So again, no, it doesn't necessarily have to be sent to a third-party lab, but you should know what tests you're doing if you choose to do it in-house, kind of, and why. And you also, if you send it to a third-party lab, you should also understand what tests are they doing and what results are they giving you. What does it mean? And that gets into the whole conversation about, what positives or if it's presumptive positive and all of those sort of questions. So you should always feel free to, speak with whatever third-party lab you choose, understand what they're doing as well.
And also something to add there, Emily, if FDA was looking at your results that were tested in-house, I think it would also require you to provide much more information to gain their confidence that, look, the testing that we're conducting in-house, we feel very confident, and also the additional certification that you may be required to be a certified lab in-house for the pathogen testing.
Mm-hmm. Sure, yeah.
Okay, good stuff. So the last question that we received is there a guidance or resource for validation of SSOPs? I can tell you that Ecolab does provide guidance and some technical resources on recommendations for validation of SSOPs. I'd be more than happy to share that information with Emily and Jennifer if they feel that they'd like to share that with the group. Emily, do you have anything to add to that, or Ashish, anything that you're aware of?
Not for me.
I would say just working with the chemical services provider and looping them in along with any internal experts that you may have, because I don't think there is a one way of going about that. It's so dependent on your equipment, process, and what really you're trying to validate. So, there could be some guidelines, but I think it would be very specific to your operations and equipment.
Correct. Yeah, and I think the key there too is, we get a lot of questions about validation and verification, right? And sometimes that terminology gets used interchangeably, but they are very different processes. And so they each serve their own part to the process as well, right? But that is something that I can follow up with as well.
All right, I'll maybe give it just a few more seconds if anybody has any other questions coming in. All right, if not, I think we can wrap it up. So again, I want to thank everyone for joining us for the webinar. As I had mentioned, we have taped the webinar and we'll be sending out a copy of the presentation or a link to the presentation to all of the attendees later this week. And again, I want to give big thanks to Brittany and Ashish as well for joining us.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you. All right, have a good afternoon, everyone.